Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the BSI Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wesexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 190. Education Never Ends.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And we are here to educate you on all things related to Sherlock Holmes and education. Are you ready for class to be in session, Burt?
Oh my goodness, I left my homework at home.
Uh-oh. The Hound of the Baskervilles ate your homework.
Yeah, that's right. That's a ticket. That's right.
Yeah, well, it's because the Selden, the escaped criminal, had been trying them on, so that would do it. Well, this is episode 190. You can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/ihose190, all lowercase. That's where you can leave us a comment, which will also get you to ihearofsherlock.com. There you can find links to us on all of the social networks of relevance, and you can become a patron, support the show for as little as $1 an episode. Your contributions help us to keep the lights on, keep the squirrels running that power the steam-powered vacuum tubes that we have here on the podcast, and most importantly, help us to be able to afford transcripts for the show. We like to make the show available to deaf and hard of hearing listeners or fans, and this is our opportunity to make that happen. Won't you join us in becoming a patron of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere for as little as $1 an episode?
Friends, you're cooped up at home and you don't have a chemical table and you can't play the violin. How can you practice social distancing, connect to your friends, and still be true to your Sherlockian values? That's why you need the new social distance communicator from Sherlock Holmes brand products. It might look like a pair of tin cans and a string, but don't be fooled. The social distance communicator comes with 3 sets of communications cords. The Watson cord is a friendly 6 feet long. The Lestrade, 8 feet long. And the Mycroft is a safe and secure 12 feet long, ensuring you keep safe social distance with every message. The Sherlock Holmes brand social distance communicator is the only communicator that delivers the 3 C's. Crystal, clear, conversations. The SHBSDC meets CDC guidelines in 221B style, and it's ready for you right now at the curb of your local Sherlock Holmes brand retailer today.
Well, we ought to invest in one of those for the podcast.
Right.
It'd be a great interviewing technique. Well, we're pleased to have Marino Alvarez and Tim Greer join us on this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now, you may be familiar with at least one of those names. Tim has been with us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere on a previous episode. And just by background, Tim is an instructor of English and Fine Arts at Memphis University School. Where else? In Memphis, Tennessee. And he teaches detective fiction, British literature, and speech. He could probably teach me a little speech right there. And he serves as the director of theater, which, if you recall, that's what we talked with Tim about the last time he was on the show. And he is the first Garadeb, that's the president of the Memphis area Sherlockian Society, the Giant Rats of Sumatra. He's spoken to groups such as Scintillation of Scions, the BSI, and many other gatherings. And he holds a Beacon Award for providing exemplary Sherlockian educational experiences, as well as 2 Memphis Theater Awards for acting, and the BSJ's 2014 Morley Montgomery Award for Outstanding Article of the Year. Tim, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back. Good to hear from you all.
Excellent. And I should note that you received your investiture in the BSI in 2016. And what was your investiture?
The Ragged Shaw from the Priory School.
I like it. Highly
at the hand of our beloved Wiggins emeritus, Michael F. Whalen.
Indeed. He was good at picking out those investitures.
I think he enjoyed that more than any other part of the job.
Indeed. And we are also pleased to have Marino Alvarez with us. Marino is a professor emeritus at Tennessee State University and formerly a senior research scientist at the Center of Excellence in Information Systems. He received his master's and EDD degrees from West Virginia University. He's co-author of The Art of Educating with V-Diagrams from Cambridge University Press, The Little Book, Conceptual Elements of Research from Rowman and Littlefield, and A Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes. He's a member of several Sherlockian societies, including the Nashville Scholars of the Three-Pipe Problem and Circular Holmes of Barcelona, Spain. His Sherlockian articles appear, among others, in the Saturday Review of Literature, Canadian Holmes, and the Baker Street Journal. He's the recipient of the Association of Literacy Educators and Researchers Laureate Award, the only recipient of both the Teacher of the Year and Distinguished Researcher of the Year awards at Tennessee State University. And Marino was invested in the Baker Street Irregulars as Hilton Soames in 2015. Marino, welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hilton
Soames, another fine educator in the canon.
Yes, it was nice to see that the investiture name coincided with my vocation.
Absolutely. And we just mentioned Hilton Soames in the last episode of Trifles.
Yes, I heard that. Yes, I did.
Yeah. Well, for folks who haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, we'll have a link to Trifles in the show notes for you. Well, gentlemen, I suppose, after that long-winded introduction, we should just briefly head over to your beginnings in Sherlock Holmes. And Marino, since we have you here just most recently, why don't you tell us about how you first discovered Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I had read him. I had read Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes as a 12-year-old. I had the Doubleday edition, and each night I read in bed, I'd read a story right before falling asleep, and so I became acquainted with Sherlock Holmes, the character, and also the other stories, which I enjoyed very much. I continued with that and reading some books and collecting some books, and then once I was a graduate student at West Virginia University, I had been in the bookstore, and there was a sale bin of books, and I picked up a book called A Doctor Enjoys Sherlock Holmes by Edward Van Leer. Edward Van Leer was the dean of the College of Medicine in 1959 and also a BSI member. And his book is what prompted me to write the other book, A Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes, because of his influence on what he had done. And West Virginia has been a very, very important part of my education. In fact, I not to sound over, I don't know how to explain this, but I was just inducted into the West Virginia University Hall of Fame, the College of Education and Human Resources, and also named a Distinguished Alumnus for 2019. So for me, that's a very big event in my life. And So that's really been coordinating part of my reading of the Sherlock Holmes stories and my affiliation with West Virginia University.
Wow. Well, congratulations on that. That's really a remarkable achievement.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about A Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes.
Well, a Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes is basically, I have something it follows almost the same kind of a pattern that Tim and I just did with the educators. Education Never Ends, in the sense that I have an introduction that talks about the various things that Sherlock Holmes comments upon, his traits, his attributes, his power of perception, and so forth. And then I also have a chapter on his resume, and then I go on to talk about other chapters that deal with, I've done a readability formula where I compare Holmes's 2 stories to Watson's stories to find out the degree of difficulty with vocabulary and so forth. So I have a chapter on that, and then it goes on to list some things about Sherlock Holmes as a college professor, which I talk about him being professor later on after retirement and how he's consulted there. And also I have a chapter that it sets up in the classroom where when I visited high school, I noticed there was an outline written on the floor of a classroom in a hallway, and I had asked the students, what does that represent? And someone said, well, they just put it there. And I said, well, what a wonderful idea for the mathematics teacher to start making problems from the outline of the body, you know. And so we started talking about DNA, and I had contacted the Metropolitan Police Department here because what Sherlock Holmes at that time he did the blood identification test, but it only could tell you the classification of blood. It could not tell you from whom it was taken from. And so I found out that from the DNA process, then it was able to trace the person. So I have several chapters on that, and it's basically for educators. Hopefully, I have a concept map of different stories that took place, and they can follow along and compare it to Edgar Allan Poe's stories. So it just helps. It's really for teachers and students and so forth and everyone, really serious Sherlockians, to kind of go through it and kind of make an analogy of historical context, the cultural context, the political context of the Victorian era. And that's basically how that evolved.
Oh, fascinating. Now, Tim, refresh us on how you first met Sherlock Holmes.
Well, I think we plowed this field pretty thoroughly the last time I was on with you. I think shouldn't I just refer your readers to look it up there, and then that'll make them go listen to another episode if they're really interested.
You tease.
I'm telling you nothing.
Well, Tim, why don't you just give us the highlights? I mean, for example,
it's easy.
The prison library. Just start. Right,
exactly. Well, and then they made us read. It was either that or make little ones out of big ones, and so it didn't take me long to figure that one out. I, as a very young boy, saw a TV airing of the Clive Brook film. Is the first exposure to Sherlock Holmes that I remember ever having. And from there to books, started off with a now age illustrated comic of Sherlock Holmes, and then a collection of some of the short stories. And I think that would have been my third Sherlock Holmes book in the ever growing collection was The Doubleday. And I love that book, read it, still have it. Wouldn't part with it. Of course, there have been a lot of Sherlock Holmes books and films and TV adaptations and so on ever since then. But I was just intrigued by the character and his world from the very beginning, and I enjoyed the movie, but I loved the stories. And so that really was, if the hook was in with the movie, then the hook was set with the short stories.
You may be the only person we've ever talked to whose first encounter with Sherlock Holmes was in the Clive Brook movie.
I was just going to say that.
It wasn't by choice, okay? So there were, I think we went over this. There were but 4 channels to choose from, and you just watched whatever was. Imagine, if you will, children, a world in a world where there is no internet.
In a world.
And only 4 channels. How will you while away an afternoon? Anyway, so But, in defense of it, it has its moments.
Oh, yeah. No, it's a charming picture.
It's a hoot.
Bert, I'm waiting for the first instance that we have a guest that says Stuart Granger was their first Sherlock Holmes.
Ooh.
That could be an interesting.
Then we'll have a lot to talk about, because if that was the case, how could you possibly have any interest in anything else connected to Sherlock Holmes ever again?
I like Stuart Granger, but not as Sherlock Holmes.
There you go.
Me too. Well, I was a big fan of his sideburns as Sherlock Holmes, but that was about it.
Well, enough of this. Let's get on to the book. That's the reason we're here. We're talking about Education Never Ends, Educators, Education, and the Sherlockian Canon. This is part of the BSI Press professional series. Other titles in that series, of course, have included Nerve and Knowledge, which is about doctors and medicine in the canon, and Canon Law, which, of course, was about lawyers and law. So let's start at the beginning. Where was the germination for this idea? Who brought it to whom?
Marino, do you remember?
I'm going to take that as a no.
I think we
so.
Take that as a no.
Good. That means I'm going to jump in then, because I distinctly remember where the book began. It was at Chautauqua.
Ah.
So if you're out there listening to this podcast and you're interested in the BSI and Sherlock Holmes and meeting other Sherlockians, do your best to come to some of the smaller conferences. The presentations and the lectures are different from what you'll hear anywhere else. They tend to be more in depth. I find them to be often fascinating. And you get more time one-on-one with people who have possibly been in the hobby longer than you, and they can introduce you to other people who will introduce you to other people, and your circle of Sherlockian friends will grow rapidly. So at that Chautauqua conference, which I know the two of you remember fondly,
we do.
I believe there was a panel discussion from the BSI Press, and John Berquist, and I forget who else, I guess maybe Robert Katz, I'm not sure, were up there, and they talked about the Professions series and I think they were about to come out with their second installment, and they mentioned these might be some future topics that we're interested in, and education was one of them, and I just corralled Marino right there on the spot and said, we're doing that book, or no one is, and let's rush the table and volunteer to do it as soon as they're finished, which is what we did. So we got
Michael
the commitment
Keane
right there on the spot. Michael Keane, you're so right.
Now, for some of our listeners who might not associate education and Sherlock Holmes, can you just sort of, Marino or Tim, could you just sort of sketch out some of the possible interactions or, ways to connect to that particular subject with Holmes? Because one of the nice things about this book, Education in the Victorian Era, is its organization, and you cover what might be the most logical area, which is, what was Holmes's education, but you also put it in the context of the time and some other things. So can you talk a little bit about it at a high level, about why it would be a fertile topic for a book?
What happened was this: when we sat down, we decided on to decide how is the book going to be organized. For example, a preliminary table of contents, and then so once we decided on some of the topics and so forth, we then started to identify who would be some authors that would be able to contribute to those particular areas of the book. And so, as you can see, the way it's laid out, we were able to get Matthias Bronson to write about the education of Holmes, which, he had just finished his best-selling book there. So we thought that was a very important piece. And then Kenneth Carr had presented a paper on the Baker Street Detective Division. So we thought that would be appropriate, since we're talking about the education and also the boys that were involved and girls in that division. And then I had visited the Ragged School in England, in London, with my wife, and we had spoken to the director. And that particular day, what they do is they have students come to this school. It was founded by Dr. Thomas Bernardo, in the 1870s, and they have children come to the school, and then they have a classroom all set up there, and they have a teacher who is an actress, and these kids walk in and they sit at these desks, the same ones where the children had sat before, and they take them through their paces, and the teacher is very stern. She has a stick, and she cracks it on the desk, and the children tells them to sit up straight and so forth. So they got a flavor of what it was like, and they really were a little bit frightened about what was going on, but they got a flavor of what it was like in that era. And so we wanted our readers also, when they read about this, all the stories in here, to put themselves in the context of the Victorian era, of the period, what was happening, what was going on during that particular time. And so we had different people writing about the different stories. Richard Ryan went on to talk about the Beacons Society, the Beacons of the Future, but more importantly, talking about who were these kids and what were the board schools like. And then Bob Katz had an idea about doing Sherlock Holmes as a physician and as a detective, which he did. And then Alex Warner, who I had met, he was the curate. He's a curator in the Museum of London, and I had attended that opening when they did the exhibition there in 2014. And he had an interest in Joseph Pennell, the artist, and that was very important to us because for Tim and I, we wanted to have the arts also in this particular book. We wanted to go, and in order to do that, it had to be a black and white print, black and white etchings. It could not have been color. So when Alex Warner was interested in Joseph Pennell, who is very well known, you can look him up. He ran the 1870s and 80s. He did sketches throughout London as well as other places here in the United States, the Western United States. Those put us a context on where these children would be roaming, and also the people in the stories would be roaming, and it would give us a nice period on where that was going. And then Tim, why don't you take on about Henry Boot and the Sherlock Holmes musical portion of it?
Sure. I think I would absolutely agree with everything Marino said so far. It kind of, if this helps you understand, Bert, we kind of try to start with like you said, from a high level, zoomed out, right, 20,000 foot view in education in the Victorian era. So we have one about the education of the author, then about the education of children in general, students in general, at different levels. Could you afford to go to a board school? Were you a street urchin who went to a free school called the Ragged School, and so on and so forth? And then in the next section, sort of zoom in on Sherlock Holmes himself and what his education might have been like. And so we have Martin Fido, the late Martin Fido, one of the greatest ripperologists of all time. I will say this. The most dangerous people in the world are newly retired people, because I remember saying one of the people here who I was wondering if this person might contribute a part of the book. I remember saying to Marino, I wonder sometimes if some of these people who are sort of well known for their writings or whatever might not appear in these books because people hesitate to ask, because everyone just assumes that they're really too busy with other projects. But I mean, what's the worst they can do? Say no. So I want to ask this one person, and then all of a sudden Marino was on a tear, and he was rounding up some great contributors. I'm really proud to have Martin Fido in the book on the education of Sherlock Holmes, and then Bob Katz. After we go from Martin's overview, we go into a series of essays of different scholars advocating for their own particular field as being one that Sherlock Holmes must have had some training in. So Katz for the medical field, Alex Werner giving us a context of visual learning and the environment that Sherlock Holmes moved in. Then Henry Boot explaining his take on how Holmes became a music lover and music appreciator and a musician himself, which has some very keen insights in it. And then we got Catherine Ramsland and James O'Brien. I don't know if Catherine Ramsland's name might be familiar to some of your listeners for all of her work in true crime and forensic psychology, looking into the aspects of the scientific method and Holmes's approach as a scientific detective. And then Curtis Armstrong, who makes a very strong case for Holmes having had some sort of formal theater training, acting training. And he finds a great many clues to support that contention.
Now, you yourself being involved with the theater, Tim, what do you make of that supposition?
Oh, I think it's a very solid assumption. I'll put it this way: observe what you see him do, and how you and the descriptions of his disguise work and so forth in the canon, and explain that in some other way.
That's a good point.
It's very difficult to explain how he acquired his makeup skill, disguise skill, acting skill, vocal impersonation skill, and so on and so on and so on, if he didn't have some kind of formal exposure to theater training. But Curtis breaks it all down for you, as of course only he can.
Well, maybe he was a Stratford-on-Avon lady. Sorry, I'll go home now.
It was quite the common practice in the time for actors starting out, especially in school. If they were doing Shakespeare, you learn to do it by playing the female parts.
Of course.
I think Laurence Olivier's first role was Katharina in Taming of the Shrew when he was a schoolboy. Yeah. So Holmes may well have been a Stratford-on-Avon lady there for a show or two.
Now, when you think about some of the aspects of Sherlock Holmes, are there talk a little bit about some of his personality traits or his habits that would have translated well as a classroom teacher, and then some that may have translated well more as a scholar researcher. Marino, I would imagine that would be something you could pick up on. How did different elements of his personality express themselves in the different aspects that teachers are expected to take on?
Well, one of the things about his persona is that when you read the stories, and there are several in which he is presented as a teacher, and even Watson says that, like a professor waving his palm in The Dancing Men, when he says various things, how he addresses a class and so forth. And there are various types of instances in which he does this. Not only he uses the Socratic method, as far as I'm concerned, because when he interviews clients and when he interviews other people that he's trying to get information from, his Socratic method of inquiry is what really divulges a lot of the information that he gathers and processes in his resolution of a case. And I think that's probably very, very important. We know the fact that he's written monographs, he's written papers, he's written books, and he studies the English charters and so forth. And in doing so, those all are a very high-end skill that require very, very strong intelligence, not only in the areas, but in a variety of areas, which I think of scholarship. And I think that comes right through the canon, and his ability to not only read people, but also to make use of the information that he gathers and also put it to paper, which is another skill that's very important.
Given all of that, let's just take ourselves outside the realm of what we know about Sherlock Holmes, and again into conjecture. If Sherlock Holmes were to give up his profession, to give up being a consulting detective, and instead of retiring to beekeeping, let's say he retired to a university town.
Yes.
What kind of setting can you see him thriving in? Would he be someone who would be at home in a board school? Would he be more the university level, or something else entirely?
In the book that you asked me about, The Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes, it was also in the Baker Street Journal. That article appeared as Sherlock Holmes as a college professor. I actually have him retiring and then being able to visit the college in which he stays there, and he's able to not only he's able to engage with their research laboratory, because he still conducts experiments. He still is able to access books and write his paper, and he wants to finish that book, The Art of Detection. And he also is able to receive, clients once in a while come in and visit him while he's there. And I think that's the setting that he would feel most comfortable with in that type of an environment.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of, that sort of environment is interesting. One of the nice things about the book is that you do start with on the other side of Sherlock Holmes, there's always Arthur Conan Doyle. You start with education in the Victorian era. And I'm just curious, in your thinking and in Matthias's essay, do you have a sense that Conan Doyle, that his skills, his talents as a storyteller were shaped by his education or despite his education?
I would think that this is just a quick assessment, but probably I would think it would be due to his experiences in life. I mean, he experienced it as a student who not only was one who thrived academically, but he did not like school. And we see that in a lot of different students that we encounter in our classrooms, that students sometimes have difficulty processing academic material, although they're very bright students. And I think what it did was his experiences, not only as a student, but also as a medical student, and later to go on to the Hope and deal with the harpooning and all those other experiences that he dealt with, and living in South Seas and seeing these children running around with no shoes and bare feet and ragged clothes. All of this, I think, culminated into an experience that said, I can take my medical background, I can take the background that I learned from Bell and so forth, and I can look at these other experiences that are taking place. And this then is the genesis for stories to evolve. And I believe basically that's how many of his stories come from.
Yeah, well, that's a lovely way to look at it. That's a great point. And I contrast that, his memoirs, when he writes about his experience early in his education, particularly in the Jesuit schools, where he seems to feel that he was being driven to conform, and he just resisted it and resisted it and resisted it at every opportunity.
Well, speaking of education and resistance, we'd like to educate you on our sponsor in the hopes that you will not resist purchasing something from Wessex Press.
Martin Freeman, Nigel Bruce, Edward Hardwick, Jude Law, James Mason, Ralph Richardson, Robert Duvall. The list of actors who've played Dr. Watson is just as rich as those who have donned the deerstalker. Generations have discovered Sherlock Holmes because of the mysteries, but they come back again and again for the characters and for the indispensable Dr. Watson. That's why you will enjoy Anne Margaret Lewis's The Watson Chronicles, a Sherlock Holmes novel in 6 connected stories that begin as Holmes contemplates retirement in 1900. It's a series of baffling mysteries, including one of the biggest of all, Watson's Wives. The Watson Chronicles by Anne Margaret Lewis understands there's always more to learn about Watson. So it's perfect for those of us who believe the noble doctor never gets enough page time. And it's available right now from our WessexPress.com.
And we're back talking with Marino Alvarez and Tim Greer about Education Never Ends, one of the latest books from the BSI Press in its Professions series. We've talked a little bit about the education, the institution of education in the Victorian era. We talked a little bit about Holmes and education. But, gentlemen, what do we make of the difference in intelligence, and they're both very high degrees of intelligence, between the Holmes brothers, Mycroft and Sherlock? Would they have received any kind of different education, or would they have been largely on the same path?
Difficult to say, because we don't know as much about Mycroft. We may rapidly exceed our warrant in searching around in that area, but of course we can always speculate. I'll bat this one out there, and we'll see if anybody else wants to bat it back in the opposite direction. Of course, there's this age-old question of, did Holmes go to Oxford or Cambridge or both or neither or so forth? Sherlock Holmes, I mean. And that we could probably debate for a long time. I've always had this creeping suspicion, though, that Mycroft Holmes went to Cambridge. Because it's a warren and a nest and a recruiting ground for spies, and always has been, even back into the Renaissance and before. It's where they found Christopher Marlowe. it almost tempts me to go to the conclusion that I think Sherlock Holmes went to Oxford, Mycroft Holmes went to Cambridge, so that might account for some of their differences in intelligence.
I would buy that.
I have been reading some papers lately, some articles from past writers, and one of the contentions is, as Tim has just said, that Mycroft Holmes was probably the one that did go to Cambridge and finished his degree because he needed that in order to enter the government service, which he eventually does, and that prepared him for that profession.
Makes sense.
Right, and then Sherlock Holmes, as far as we know, didn't take a degree at all, is described as a desultory reader. But then if you look at Dr. Watson's famous list, Sherlock Holmes, his limits, in A Study in Scarlet, Watson stretches his own deductive abilities there to show us the things that he thinks Sherlock Holmes is well educated in. Of course, chemistry is very high on the list, and anatomy is not, he thinks, at the level of someone like himself, perhaps a physician. He says accurate but unsystematic, and so on and so on and so on. What is laid out for us there in fiction, long before it exists in fact, is a course of instruction for someone who wants to be a detective. It's a criminology degree before there was such a thing. So you had to be a desultory reader and make your own course of study. He seems to have a very clear idea of what he's going to need, and disregarded the idea of having a degree as irrelevant for the profession he wanted to pursue.
Yeah, that makes great sense.
But it wasn't until a little after the turn of the century that you could actually go to college and get a degree in criminology, criminalistics.
Yeah, I like that a lot. You know, the lovely thing about Sherlock Holmes, and on the many things in the cases of Sherlock Holmes and education, and you alluded to this earlier, Tim, is the various references or the personifications of education that you find in the canon. And I know you have an essay in the book, Tim, about canonical teachers. Can you talk a little bit about what somebody might learn from the way educators are presented in the canon?
Sure. As we were going on in the book, right, and we were having such great success with terrific contributors and the outline taking shape, we knew we wanted to save a section for the end that went into practical application for people who are actually out there teaching the Sherlock Holmes stories or want to. And so somewhere in between, we kind of had to get down to this idea of the figure of the teacher as depicted in the canon. And so I don't remember if I volunteered or got conned into taking that one on, but it was one or the other. But it is a chapter called Canonical Teachers. And that led to a great deal of combing through the canon, looking for, I think I used the phrase teachers or teacher figures. So I included governesses, tutors, you get the idea, as canonical teacher types. And I had a big sort of splatter graph list at first, which started to develop columns, and then I got down to a 2-column list. And it emerged very quickly in the research that we were looking here at a great many good teachers and bad and evil teachers. I don't mean bad teachers as in they aren't able to teach people anything, but they're just they've gone over to the dark side. And I thought, well, surely there will be more good teachers than evil. Nope, it was pretty much exactly the same number of sketchy, shady, or downright terrible, nefarious teachers as exemplary ones. And so then the idea for the chapter really kind of emerged, which was, what makes the difference between the two? Or in the canon or in the eyes of Conan Doyle, are there some characteristics that come up over and over again that distinguish an admirable, stalwart, good teacher from a sinister, despicable one? And I think we found a few, which the chapter goes into. But among them are, I suppose honesty or the lack thereof is a big one. When you think about it's easy to miss this in Hound of the Baskervilles. I had to remind myself of it all over again. But Stapleton was a counterfeit teacher and had a school. He tells Dr. Watson this in his backstory, and Holmes verifies it in his research into Stapleton's background. Stapleton may be one of the few serial killers that we encounter in the canon. if you look at his list of slain, he might get up into the numbers of into the required body count total to qualify as a serial killer, though not a traditional model of one. But he seems to have used the school and his students as a convenient cover identity, just to create false identities for himself and his wife. And a lot of his students ended up dead through questionable circumstances. It may have been disease, or if it were a disease brought on by neglect of the proper running of the school, we don't know for sure, but it's certainly hinted at. Meanwhile, you have other teachers like Heidegger in the Priory School who literally lays down his life in defense of his student against what he believes is kidnapping underfoot, and he's quite correct.
Well, and you've got very brave, you mentioned these teacher figures. You also have very brave, in addition to Heidegger, figures like Violet Hunter, who
what a cool head you encounter there in both of the teaching Violets.
Yes,
they're sort of become undercover operatives, and nerves of steel, both of them.
Yes, and she goes on to become the head of a school. So,
yeah,
fascinating.
Now, as you were doing your research for that article, Tim, how many teachers did you tally up in the canon? Did you have a total?
I'd have to go back and dig that out, but I had to pick the best representative examples for the sake of fitting it into a chapter. I'll tell you that much. I think I did something like six good and 6 evil, and but there were others that I just had to cut for the sake of brevity.
Well, before we get into some of the practical applications of the Sherlock Holmes and teaching today, let's just pause and get a little bit of feedback from the two of you. As you think through the canon, as you think about some of these educational figures, these teachers, professors, etc., who is your favorite teacher in the canon, and why?
Let me say I think it'd be difficult to pick a favorite teacher because we don't really get a lot of insight on what they actually do. We know their background, like we know Huxley, his background, his credentials, and we know Professor Pressbury, who obviously is a little bit off the deep end, but he must be somewhat proficient in his field. And Moriarty, obviously, was very proficient in mathematics and a teacher there, but he had his other side that came through. And again, I guess the one that comes to my mind that's actually doing some kind of teaching is only because he gives an exam, and that is Hilton Soames. And although the exam is trivial in the sense that they would have asked more from their students than simply to just translate a short version of a text, it gives the indication that he is doing some kind of teaching in that particular field. And I think that's probably the only indicator I have of someone who is teaching in a context, because we have something to relate it to, and that is the Greek classics, in the sense that the students have to write an interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one could say you're a little biased given your investiture, Marino.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I thought he would just say Hilton Soames.
That may be the case.
Right. So I would point out a couple who I think are ranked pretty high. And the missing 3/4, Dr. Leslie Armstrong, is a person who deserves our attention, I think, in that, for one, when Holmes is not certain of his status in the tale, that he may be complicit in some foul play, he describes Armstrong, I'll paraphrase it, but he's something like, "This is the most formidable opponent we've seen since Professor Moriarty. This is the most like Moriarty that we've seen anyone be." Someone not to be taken lightly, because he does kind of get the better of Sherlock Holmes in one of his early attempts to pursue Armstrong. But of course, he's no ultimate match. It's just sort of Sherlock Holmes has to go to his A game when he realizes the quality of his opponent here. But now Armstrong for his part, holds Holmes and Watson at arm's length because he's attempting to protect his student and the trust and the promise that they shared, until he realizes Holmes and Watson are in fact allies, and then everything changes.
Yeah.
So there are some things that are praiseworthy there, I think. My favorite teacher in the canon, though, will it surprise you, Sherlock Holmes. And his lifelong training of other detectives. He can't be everywhere, more's the pity, and so he trains Francois Le Villard and Alec MacDonald, Stanley Hopkins, and so on. He has quite a few faithful disciples who are committed to learning his methods, but I think I described them as see if I can find it. His two most consistent and long-suffering students, Inspector Lestrade and Dr. Watson.
Well, and we shouldn't forget about the Baker Street Irregulars, too. He had a whole cadre of them. I mean, they weren't trained in the scientific method.
Who knows what they may have grown up to become.
That's true. There have been entire pastiches based on that. So,
yeah.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about the practical applications, because I was fascinated to get to the last section in the book, which is titled "Using Education to Promote the Study of the Sherlockian Canon, Essays for Educators." We go through, and we've got contributions from Shannon Carlisle, who's been on the show here before, and Rob Nunn, and you, Tim, and Ashley Polisek, all about teaching Sherlock Holmes from the elementary level all the way up to the college university level. What were you hoping that you would get out of this kind of section, and how did each one of these authors put their particular spin or stamp on it?
Well, from our perspective, it was very important. We thought that we would have a section written by teachers and how they actually use the canon in their classrooms. In essence, this is what the book is probably trying to promote. Shannon Carlisle, I visit her classroom fairly often and meet with her students and so forth. So I see what an exceptional educator she really is, and how she really makes use of the canon and the stories and the stories themselves in educating her students with literature that goes beyond just the stories, but into other realms of the curriculum. And she's very, very good. Rob Nunn was when I was on the Beacon Society, the chair of the awards committee. Rob had won the Beacon Award, and so I was aware of what he was doing in the middle school. And then Tim was aware of Ashley Polisek, and so we wanted, and I knew Tim obviously was teaching executive fiction at his school, and so we wanted these educators more or less to kind of show that Sherlock Holmes can be taught not only by teachers but by parents or by guardians or by other people librarians and so forth, in a classroom setting. And these are some ideas that they can glean from in order to teach that particular content for various levels of students. And we thought that was important. I just want to mention one thing here. There's one thing that I do regret. I had there was going to be another topic, and it was going to be teaching Sherlock Holmes in the prison. And I had this person that had taught in the prison, and he had used Sherlock Holmes with adolescents in the prison. And we were hoping that was going to come about. And unfortunately, that did not happen. But that would have been an excellent addition, I think, to this particular section.
Hopefully we can get that into the 10th anniversary edition.
Do we know of anyone actually doing that?
Oh, yeah.
I do know. I do know the person that did that, and for some reason he was not able to complete that one, but that would have been something that would have been very, very welcomed.
Yeah.
Do you remember, the general gist of it? Because one of the things that occurs to me when I hear you say that is, I think it's in one of the Rathbone films. I mean, occasionally, there's a scene, probably usually in the movies, maybe with Basil Rathbone, where Rathbone will encounter some old lag that he put away years ago. And in a few words, he explains what his errors were. And, the convict walks away muttering at his own stupidity. But I'm just wondering what the application of Sherlock Holmes in a penal environment would be. Would it be as English literature to appreciate stories and tales, or would it be the importance of observation and detail? Would it be justice and right, or would it be some mix of all of those things?
I believe what he wanted to do, and I didn't get an opportunity to, obviously they didn't complete it. We didn't get the full measure of it, but in speaking with him, that not only did he use it for literature in the stories, but he also used it for students to identify with what are some of the situations that occurred in some of the stories. How does it relate to your personal experience and so forth? And he also tried to make it more of a personalized type of situation where the students could write about those things and be able to share those stories with the other students in the class. And I think that would have been just very, very fruitful to understand.
I wanted Bert to respond to that question too in a more general way. Maybe it's kind of the whole idea, or a big idea of this final section of the book, was to provide inspiration for people who would like to teach the stories, or are teaching the stories right now, but might encounter an idea that hadn't occurred to them in some way, and to sort of make the case through taking it through all up through elementary school to middle school to high school to college and university, that you can use the canon to teach blank, and you can put almost anything in the blank.
I like
you can use
that.
it to teach. You can use it to teach chemistry. You can use it to teach literature. You can use it to teach writing. You can use it to teach history. You can, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. Yeah. You can even use it to teach trigonometry.
As long as you have an eraser.
Use it to teach art, because Holmes is revealed in art, and there's a lot of things in which you can take from that. So we tried to show that the canon itself transcends the curriculum in all the subjects: music, art, science, and history, and so forth. That it can be used not just within the context of literature, theme, plot, setting, character, the structural elements, but beyond that into other areas.
I like that. Well, we're going to use Sherlock.
Mutiny on the podcast. Mutiny on the podcast. I want to ask you guys a question. Scott and Bert.
Well, we're going to use Sherlock Holmes to teach podcasting. How's that, Tim?
You can. You have been. You have been.
Exactly right.
So, who was one of your favorite teachers, and why?
In the canon or in real life?
In real life. No, in real life.
Oh.
Because the book is applicable to just about everyone, in that we've all had the experience of being one of these kids in a school very much like one of these schools, I think. And it's one of those it's a great topic for profession series, because alas, we're going to have encounters with lawyers and doctors, but maybe the encounters with teachers, some of them could be positive.
Right.
Well, from personal experience, from a person who did not care for school as a student, I didn't really get into education, appreciate it until I got into a college setting. But I started off in first grade with a teacher who did not believe that a person should write with their left hand, and so this teacher would first come and tap me on my left hand and move the pencil to my right. And then she came with a ruler and started hitting me on the left hand until I moved it on my right, which I refused to do. And a physician happened to come to do a check for the students. And he asked me, he said, "Why is your hand so red?" I said, "It's because this teacher keeps beating me with this ruler." And he said to her, "You have to let him just write left-handed." And she took not just a little offense, but a major offense, because she said, "I've always been able to change people from left to right hand." And that was my initial indoctrination into the school setting. But I did have one teacher, Mrs. Mastriani, in second grade, who I thought was just a wonderful teacher. And I took a lot from what she did in the classroom, later on applied it into my own teaching, which I thought was very important. But you have to know, really, as a teacher, as a student growing up, you have to realize what are the things that are not appealing, so that when you become a teacher, you can reverse that trend and make things that seem to you to be not important, to make it important in an appealing way, so that students can be able to understand the material in a meaningful way rather than just an indoctrination.
Bert, do you have any stories about being flogged in school?
I should have. I do remember. Yeah, I do remember an English or a homeroom teacher when I was in elementary school who smacked me for. And I was very surprised because she interpreted. I figured out later that she interpreted something that I said as being very vulgar, and that wasn't anything I was trying to communicate to her. I was just. But so I do remember that. No, there are a lot of teachers in my life who've made a big difference. I can think of two from high school, Ed Morrison, who taught history, and Lou Katz, who was our homeroom teacher in high school. And Ed Morrison, who's still living, by the way, and I wrote him a note about, 8 or 9 months ago. He made history a lot of fun. He had trivia contests. He was a great educator. He was a very elegant guy, but he was also very eloquent. And Lou Katz was just a great friend. I mean, I was part of the alumni organization, and I remember he got a bunch of us in his car and drove us to work at the alumni dinner. And on the way, gave us driving lessons. And he was very philosophical. There was a lot to learn from him. And then in college, William S. Hill was my professor in Shakespeare, who really brought Shakespearean theater the works of Shakespeare alive. And then I've had friends since formal school, who have been great educators, people like Henry Bottinger, who was a great friend of mine and who has written a couple of books, who was sort of a Renaissance man. But I have a lot of memorable teachers who were professionally teachers or just inspiring in other ways.
All right, Scott.
Bert, I was half waiting for you to use your example of bringing the big Sherlock Holmes book up to Mrs. Ritchie and saying, look, heavy reading.
Yeah, I like Mrs. Ritchie, but she's not on my list. Yeah.
Well, it's funny in listening to, these recollections here, how when corporal punishment or certain strictures come into mind, those are teachers that stand out with us. And I think back to the teachers that were on the strict end of the scale. And a lot of them happened in middle school because, well, quite frankly, that's where you need to kind of put your foot down, where the kids are the most unruly. And I think those were some of the best teachers I ever had. And not necessarily because they were strict, but in their strictness were helpful. Were trying to teach us something. And I remember in 6th grade having a teacher by the name of Mrs. Montecalvo who had this enormous project that every 6th grader had to accomplish. And it was I'm trying to think of if it was an English class or a social studies class. I don't recall, but it was called the Newspaper Project. And what she did over the course of a semester is she created these mini assignments where you had to go through and familiarize yourself with different elements of the newspaper. And you had to, pick a stock and follow the stock charts for the course of a couple of weeks and see how you did. You had to understand what the elements of a good investigative journalism story were. And she taught us the basics of journalism. She helped us understand why there were ads in the paper and what different ads served, whether they were classified ads or store ads or car ads or what have you. And it really became a civics project that educated us on better communication and curation. And by the end of the semester, you had, about a 2-inch stack of construction paper with pasted on articles and sections of the newspaper and an essay or a little narrative where you told the story about what you learned from each aspect of that assignment. And by the time I was done with that, because everybody kind of feared Mrs. Montecalvo and this project and her level of strictness about it. But by the time I was done with it, I was so proud of the work that I had accomplished and the work product that was the output. That I looked back on that and thought, wow, what an amazing lesson in my life. I ran into her years later. I think I was out of college. I ran into her in the supermarket. And, I just had nothing but glowing things to say to her and about her. And in conjunction with Mrs. Montecalvo, in 8th grade, we had an English teacher by the name of Mr. Shirk, who was a very no-nonsense guy. And he believed that there were 3 certainties in life: death, taxes, and spelling tests on Fridays. and he ran his classroom that way. Whether it was sentence diagramming or spelling or grammar, we learned it all from Mr. Shirk, and I have him to thank for that.
Scott, I want to just add to what you had said because it's very important. I bet you she really appreciated your comments when you approached her and told her how much you appreciated her class. One of the things about teachers, and I'm sure Tim has experienced this also, has these other teachers that we have writing in that section, is that the part that gives you the most chills is when you receive a note, or when you receive a letter, or when you see a former student come up to you and tell you how much they have appreciated and learned from your class and so forth. And that really is the gratification that you get from becoming a teacher.
Yeah. It's amazing because to me she seemed a lot softer, whether it was her old age or, my different perspective on her personality. But yes. To your point, Marino, I think that admission of gratitude, I think it really affected her.
I'm sure it did. There's no question.
Well, that puts a lot of gas in a teacher's tank. You have to know that. That'll go further than a lot of other kinds of remuneration will. You take those notes and cards and now emails and so forth, and you put them in a binder that says, in case of quitting, break glass on the front. So there are invariably days where you may think, man, I can't do this anymore. Yeah. This is killing me. And then you open that and go, I could do this 5, 6, 7 more years.
That's great. That's great. Well, in terms of this episode, gentlemen, the gratitude is all ours. Thank you so much for spending the time with us talking about the teaching profession and particularly about this fine book, Education Never Ends, Education, Educators, and the Sherlockian Canon, which is available from the BSI Press.
Scott, could we say one more thing here? I think that both Tim and I, we don't want to neglect the fact that the contributions that John Berquist and Bob Katz and Marcia Pollack made to this volume, and
absolutely.
Also we thank Michael Deidre also for writing the foreword. And it was actually Marcia Pollack who asked us about the role of the librarian, the sub-librarian, in which Catherine Cook wrote a wonderful article on. So we do want to acknowledge them also.
Excellent.
As she always does, turns in a brilliant and impeccable chapter. Anytime I'm editing something, if she's written part of it, I say, I'll edit Catherine's chapter. Because there won't be anything that needs to.
There you go.
We love you, Catherine.
Well done. Well, gentlemen, on behalf of everyone involved in the project, thank you for seeing it through, and thank you for sharing your story here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Bert. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Great to be with you again. Marino, good to hear from you.
You also, Tim.
Well, it's very appropriate in a book about Sherlock Holmes and education to say that I learned something. I learned, and I really like this, the idea, Tim's rationale for Oxford or Cambridge. See, this is something we've got to go back and think about. Nick Utekin's point of view about this, that Mycroft went to Cambridge because it's always been a nest of spies, and Holmes and Sherlock probably went to Oxford, and that is possibly a point of contention between them. But that was interesting. But the whole conversation was interesting, and there's so much here. I'm sad we didn't get a chance to drill into Holmes and music and Holmes and learning the violin and things like that. But that's all waiting for us in the book.
Yeah, well, and that could be potential fodder for another standalone show if we wanted to delve into that particular topic with, I guess, with Henry Boot or anyone else. So,
oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, I'll make a note of that. the one thing that stood out to me was just as we concluded there, how Tim mentioned how meaningful it is for teachers to hear from their students. And I think during this time in particular, when we are all socially isolated, as we talked about on the last episode, and we're relying more on, well, in some cases, video calls, but what a great opportunity to catch up on your written correspondence. And in doing so, why not take a moment to think of a teacher that affected you, to think of a teacher that pushed you maybe in the direction of Sherlock Holmes, or maybe in the direction of your profession, or gave you a bit of advice and counsel when you sorely needed it and put you on the right track. Why don't you take this time to pen a quick note to that teacher? Look them up, send it back to your school in their care or what have you. But write them a note and tell them how much they meant to you and just make their day. It's the least you can do to show for someone who gave countless hours of their life to improving yours. Well, those dulcet tones mean that it's time to get to our Canonical Couplet, everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. If you remember, the last time we were together, we did this live, which was fun. We gave you this clue. Dogs don't make mistakes, claimed Sherlock Holmes. That uncovered the ruse, as did some old bones. Bert, do you know which story this refers to?
Oh, sure. Well, Bones is the dead giveaway there. That's the story about the chiropractor with the strange practice for resetting posture. That's the story that was called The Spine on the Floor, wasn't
it? Yeah, that was exactly it. You win.
See,
you win this time,
I knew
Bert.
that was it.
Oh, yeah, close. No, this story we were looking for this time around in terms of dogs making mistakes. A lot of people shouted out not shouted out, but they typed out during our live stream directly in the comments there because they didn't listen to directions. They typed in Silver Blaze, and they would be wrong. You see, in this case, Holmes, this was a direct quote from Holmes. Dogs don't make mistakes, he said. And that was in Shoscombe Old Place. Shoscombe Old Place. And in this instance, we had a number of people who corrected the record afterwards, saw all those wrong Silver Blazes, and wrote into us claiming Shoscombe Old Place. So now we're going to haul out the big spinning wheel, and we're going to give it a big spin. We watch it go around, landing on a random number, so we can pick our winner. Number 21, Lucky 21. And that corresponds to James McCartan. Congratulations. We will have the prize off to you, which, if you recall, is The Sherlock Holmes Companion by Michael and Molly Hardwick. And now, this time around, we have another fine prize to give away. It is a copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a fine leatherette cover version from 1974 with an introduction by Eric Ambler. And you can win this book if you are among the correct answers to this canonical couplet. The killer nearly escaped if it weren't for a hook. The clue was buried in a half-remembered book. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, jot it down in an email. Put canonical couplet in the subject line and let us know at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. If you are among the lucky guesses and we pick your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. All right.
Excellent. Well, that's a couple of great prizes there and some very good clues.
Yeah. Well, I like letting people know what they're vying for. It seems like we get a few more participants rather than just leaving it up to their imagination.
Yeah.
So, And, if you have old Sherlockiana that you're looking to get rid of, you'd like to donate it to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, just let us know. You can reach us at that same email address, which is comment@ihearofsherlock.com, which is also where you can send us feedback, fan mail, etc. And don't forget to leave a rating or a review for us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. We do appreciate it, and every review we get helps other people find the show. Well, we're finding the show has reached its natural conclusion, and I suppose that leads me to conclude that I am the always teachable Scott Monty.
Oh, and I am the incorrigible and hopeless Burt Wolder.
And together we say, The game's
afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.